Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandre Sousa, and this is my podcast. And today I will be conducting an interview with Mr. Raymond Ibrahim, who is an American author and historian specializing in history of Christianity and Islam, with particular emphasis on early Islamic conquests, religion and persecution, and civilization conflict. And I thank you very much for being here. And I would like firstly to ask you about your path to this specializing in history and Christianity and Islam. What made you go into this type of studies? Why did you do it? What was the motivation behind it?
Okay, so I was initially always very much interested in history in general. I find history fascinating. I think it's a very important discipline, and this is another topic, but it's also being manipulated, I think, in modern times, because whoever controls the narrative of the past has a lot of power over what happens in the present. The reason I was interested in the particular Islam/Christian nexus is of my own personal background. I think it's normal for people to gravitate and study the historical aspects that are somehow related to them personally. And so my family are Coptic Christians from Egypt. That would be the native inhabitants of Egypt, the indigenous peoples who were Christians, one of the earliest and largest Christian nations historically, Egypt, until it got conquered by Islam in the 7th century. And so growing up as a Copt with my family heritage, I was always, again, as I mentioned, interested in that dynamic of Christianity and Islam and how they interacted historically, doctrinal differences, and that sort of thing. So in college, I majored in history. And during my master's thesis, where you start specializing, I started focusing more exclusively on early Islam and its conflict with Christianity, surrounding Christianity, which culminated in my master's thesis, which I think came out around 2001 or 2000. And that looked at the earliest military conflict between Christendom and Islam, which would be the Battle of Yarmouk, the earliest significant one, that is, in 636. And since that time, I've continued my studies, both historical, doctrinal, contemporary. I've also branched out and looked at the persecution of Christians in the modern era and sort of traced its doctrinal and historical continuity to the past. So, yeah, but basically, in short, that's the reason I was interested in this field.
Sure. And today, as I said, as a Portuguese person, I couldn't resist speaking about the Reconquista. And I wanted to ask you about this first step on the Iberian Peninsula, but in Portugal specifically. It was like the flame of resistance after the total collapse of the Visigoth, the kingdom, in 700. How did a small brave spark of resistance in the Asturian mountains manage to survive, firstly, and eventually ignite the centuries-long fire for the Portuguese liberation, let's say?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating story. I've written much about it, and I made videos about it. You know, the mustard seed, as it's known, Pelagius. So after the fall of the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania, essentially, in the Arab and Muslim invasion is in 711, and depending on which source, it's conquered relatively quickly. The Battle of Guadalete, defeats the Visigoths, but there's still some resistance. Eventually, essentially, the whole of the Iberian Peninsula is conquered, except for the northwest quadrant around the Asturia Mountains. And there you have basically, the story is that a lot of the Christians had submitted one way or the other to the Muslims, especially in the south, and they had now at this point would become dhimmis. And but also in the north, I think the Islamic expansion was still rather tenuous. And long story short, Paleo, this nobleman who, again, depending on which source you look at, was somehow related possibly to Roderick, the last Visigothic king, or he was his sword bearer possibly. He gets into a quarrel. At one point, he had acquiesced to Islamic rule, but then he gets in a quarrel. Apparently, some governor seized his sister, and he flees into the mountains of Asturia, the final free place where any Christian who doesn't want to submit essentially to Islam has gone to in hiding. And according to the sources, he assembles there and rallies a lot of the final holdouts, the Christians of the Iberian Peninsula. And from there, that's where essentially the Reconquista starts. And the story is, of course, the pivotal, opening battles, Battle of Covadonga, when the Muslims come to essentially conquer him, and they send a bishop, one of these many Christians who had acquiesced to Muslim rule. I believe his name is Appa, and he meets him at the mouth of the cave where he's hiding, and basically he tries to tell him, he talks him into reason, saying, you've already lost to them at Guadalete at that battle, and now you're even more outnumbered. So this is suicide. Why don't you be like the rest of us and bend the knee to the Muslims and enjoy many good things. And it is at that point where Pelayo gives a very defiant speech and says that he won't do it. He wants nothing to do with them. And he says, out of this little tiny mountain, he likens it to the mustard seed in the parable of Christ, where basically something very small, in this case, faith, can become so large and powerful. And so he makes that prophecy essentially. And it's from there that the Reconquista technically really starts, at least there's some historians who will tell you this is legendary, that this is not really accurate, and the real Reconquista starts in 1085 with the conquest of Toledo. But I like the former story personally, and I think it's obviously there has to be much truth to it. It wouldn't have existed otherwise. I'm just telling you what a lot of secular historians will tell you, as I'm sure you probably know.
Sure.
And so from there it really starts, and then out of that mustard seed, you have various kingdoms that morph. Leon, and then after that, and connected with it, Castile, and then Galicia even earlier, which I think is more or less is where Portugal starts to emerge out of as well. And you have Aragon in the east, and all these various kingdoms in different times and epochs start fighting and driving southward. And we'll be looking specifically, I believe, at Portugal. But so that would I guess be the genesis in a nutshell.
I would like to ask you, for my audience, in the Muslim occupations, basically the country that's occupied has like three options. Its people has like three options: or it submits to Islam, it pays a tax, an extra tax. I don't recall the name. Or it leaves. How did it work in the Iberian Peninsula, and specifically in Portugal?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is the classical Islamic system, which is what Islam offers non-Muslims three choices, which is basically the first one is convert peacefully and you become an equal or a fellow brother in Islam. The second one is you can keep your religion, and this is primarily for Christians and Jews and people they call them people of the book. These are people who have scriptures that come before Islam that are nominally tolerated. And so all they have to do is pay tribute. This is jizya, it's what it's called. And in price of that, they are now tolerated. This doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that they're equal or they're seen as equal citizens. They're just, the best way to put it, second or maybe third class citizens who are tolerated. And they have to follow a lot of special rules just for them. They can't build churches. The pre-existing churches, if they surrendered, can exist, but they can't even fix those churches. This actually goes on till today in a lot of Muslim countries. They can't talk about the religion. They can't show a cross. They can't. All right,
we have another guest.
yeah. They can't, try to preach Christianity to Muslims. Certainly, they can't do that. They can't get in the way of fellow Christians who want to convert to Islam, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts of things which have actually spilled into the modern era as well. And the third choice, if you don't want that, is you fight till the death. Okay. So this, of course, this entire system came to the Iberian Peninsula as well. And as I mentioned at 711 during the conquest, a lot of the Christians in the southern area did accept what would be called the dhimmi status, and they paid tribute. And in the north, again, it was the same dynamic, especially later in the century. But and then this is when we get the story of Pelayo, which we mentioned. It was the same. So Portugal, as I understand it, doesn't even exist during this time. What we have is just Hispania And then later, what we're going to have is all these various, what we call the Spains, different kingdoms that come out. Okay, like I mentioned, Leon and Castile and so forth. And so Portugal, which doesn't exist at this point, it's later. I think it becomes the first kind of manifestation is a Portugal. It's like a port up north by Galicia. And so when it's under Islamic rule, which it is at this early area, all the Christians there are subject peoples. And if they maintain their religion, then they're paying the tax and living like the second-class citizens that I mentioned.
Yeah, it comes from the Portugal, but it was like from the receive
gates.
ships. Yeah. It was like that. I would like to ask you about the practical steps of the Reconquista. So we had like this resistance at the north that started this process that lasted like I don't know, a few kings went through it, and I would like to ask you for the first step and the practical steps that were taken from this resistance group that lasted for a few years, let's say.
The first steps? You mean the initial steps?
Yeah. So how did it went, the Reconquista from the beginning?
Well, I don't know if that's very clear. And if you actually speak to different historians or different theories, like I said, even the actual coming into existence of the various kingdoms following Paleo and Asturia is kind of shrouded in mist. How all this happens, you have Leon and then Castile, which I believe was the frontier of Leon, and it had castles, which is why it's called Castile. And but depending on the epoch and the different times, as we know, a lot of the Christians, for example, especially in the north, would make peace with the Muslims, and they would, and especially later on, the stories of El Cid, where the Muslims and Christians can sometimes be allied against other Muslims and Christians, which I think is much exaggerated, actually, but it did exist. That's why I say I only bring it up to point out that how the initiation of the first steps. There's different theories. The first step could have been the Paleo story, right? Others trace it to, I think, Fernando III of Castile, who would be, I may be wrong if he's Fernando III or which one, but he would be the father of Alfonso, who conquered Toledo. A lot of people would put it to him as the initial person who started to do it. But you always had manifestations of this, which was essentially the Christians of these areas looking southward. So, for example, the founder of Portugal, Afonso Henriques, after he was very young, when he was, his father, I believe, died when he was 3 years old, and his mother essentially ruled, but from afar. I think she was Galician, maybe. And but he stayed there, and he was raised there properly. He became very militant. He actually, I find him very interesting because maybe I've written a book that deals with the Knights of the Temple, and he was essentially almost like a Templar. He was an early sponsor of them. In his charters, he talks about them as his fellow brothers, and he donated much land to them, as did his mother actually before him. And early on, he really looked to the frontier, and he started fighting the Muslims on that zone. He threw himself there along that frontier of where he was the count, essentially, in his young years. And then of course the battle of I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Orique, in 1139, I think, was a major pivotal battle against the Almoravids, and the Almoravids were essentially jihadists who had come from Africa. This is during the Cid's era as well, but he had a very decisive defeat against them. It has miracles in it. It's I believe it's one of the major battles of Portuguese history. It's really almost the founding one, because at that point, I believe his men proclaimed him king due to how well he had done, because that was such a remarkable feat and he was relatively young. Which didn't sit very well with his cousin in Castile, I think Alfonso VII.
Yeah.
And but after many years, or a few years actually, and there were some conflicts, he did allow him. He became king of what would become Portugal, and this is because the other Alfonso VII wanted to be emperor, so it didn't sound so bad if the other one was a king. But anyway, he continued. What's really impressive, I find, about Afonso, actually many things. He's one of those characters. When I wrote my book, Defenders of the West, there were so many heroes I didn't have space for, and he's definitely one of them. That I wanted to include him, and maybe at some later point I will. But along with his connection to the Templars, which means that he was he was a militant Christian. Okay, he was a crusader essentially.
Mhm.
And aside from the fact that he really threw himself at the border and fought there, and the pivotal victory in 1139, that he actually became the first king, a separate kingdom of what would become Portugal. And then also very important is the Second Crusade. When we think of the Second Crusade, it's one of the most disastrous of all of the Crusades, because the way we hear it, because when we think of the Crusades, it's always in the East, in the Holy Land. And it completely failed, of course. It featured King Louis of France, I think the Seventh, and Conrad of Germany, and both of them, failed miserably. It's unfortunate. But what we don't really hear is that during the Second Crusade, a lot of crusaders from the north who were going to the Holy Land by ship, a lot of English and Flemish and northern crusaders stopped in the port where Enrique was, and they actually helped him during during these wars to actually conquer a lot more kingdoms, especially most notably Lisbon, which was a very important, which had been held by Muslims since the 8th century in the year 711 during that conquest. So that was another remarkable and significant victory under Afonso's reign, and the Templars again were there also helping. So I think it's important for people to remember that even though the Second Crusade was a failure, it was an amazing success in the context of the forging of the Kingdom of Portugal. But I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
And that was my next question. I would like to ask you, in what way these military religious orders, such as the Temple and Santiago, were indispensable to allow Portugal to claim their land, basically. I would like to ask you about the composition of this military religious orders, and for my audience to understand it as it is.
Yeah, the military orders were fundamental, both in the Holy Land and in the Spains, in Hispania, and in Portugal. And that's because, the reason they were very fundamental to me, I always say that the Iberian Peninsula was a microcosm of the Jihad and the Crusade, because it was all the elements and all the ingredients were there in one peninsula. The Spains, you had a massive Muslim presence which had conquered and had been there for centuries, and you had the indigenous Christians who were trying to reclaim their land, and the Knights of the Temple, which is the oldest military order, was founded in the Holy Land soon after the First Crusade. And the reason it was founded was because although Jerusalem and various Christian regions had been reconquered in the Holy Land and brought back under Christian rule, pilgrims who were going there were still getting mauled and attacked and killed by Muslims, because it was essentially Christian kingdoms in an Islamic sea, a very hostile Islamic sea. So the Templars were essentially these early knights who vowed themselves to protect pilgrims, and they essentially became monks. So they were warrior monks, and they took the vows of chastity and obedience and poverty, which were, of course, ubiquitous to all monks and holy orders. And they had one of their champions was Bernard of Clairvaux, who actually is one of he's the one that preached the Second Crusade that we were talking about. But the military orders, what was interesting about them and how he preached it is this was an interesting fusion of piety with militancy. So now it wasn't just that Christians can fight back, which always was part of it, Christian doctrine, because that was part of holy war, just war, doctrine, as articulated by Augustine, almost a millennium earlier, or about 700 years earlier. And but now it became, they understood it as so, for example, they would quote scriptures about Jesus saying, the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart and love your fellow man. And so the Crusade was doing that. The Crusade was liberating the Holy Sepulchre, the holy sites, because holy places and sacred sites mattered to Christians back then the way they do today to Muslims and Jews. And so they that was protecting God and honoring God, and then protecting your fellow man was essentially what the Templars were doing. And with them as well, all the military orders, such as the Knights of the Hospital and the Teutonic Knights, and so forth. And keeping the Templars in mind, because they're the earliest, they also branched out quickly and started building essentially preceptories or commanderies, where they would raise recruits in Europe and resources to send back to the Holy Land. And as I mentioned, one of the earliest sponsors of them was Iberia, for obvious reasons, because they had the same exact war going on with Muslims. So they did support them, especially, as I mentioned, Afonso, his mother, others from other kingdoms. And at the same time, because the logic of the military orders was very conducive to crusading, and because the Iberian Peninsula, like I said, was another theater of war, just like the Holy Land, native military orders also rose up in Spain, such as you mentioned, Santiago, and many others rose up. And so they became pivotal to essentially the Reconquista, both for the Spains, for Portugal, and so forth, because what happened is these military orders essentially became the backbone of crusading, because these were the men who were the most committed to this sort of warfare, unlike, let's say, secular warriors and knights and and even secular crusaders. They would come and fight and then go, which was good, it was noble. But these guys, this was their life. So they lived on the frontier, constantly warring with Muslims and trying to reclaim Christian land, which is to say, expand further south in the context of Portugal and the other kingdoms, Castile and Leon and Aragon and so forth. So and this is why when you look at the sources and you read about the Reconquista, you always find these military orders, both the Knights of the Temple, the Hospitallers as well, and the native orders that we mentioned. And there were many of them, actually, because, like I said, Spain was very conducive to that mentality, which first started in the Holy Land, because that also was conducive, because both of them featured Christians surrounded by Muslims, Christians trying to reclaim their territory. So, in short, the logic of the military orders, the theology behind it, which really supported military warfare and saw it as a pious thing, okay? Not because you're fighting out of anger and hatred, but
Sure.
because you are fighting for just cause, for a righteous cause, for the honor of God, for the protection of your fellow man, okay? So I think that mentality was very pivotal and essential, actually, to the Reconquista.
Sure, and the Reconquista, even today, it's like understood as some aggression, some random aggression towards some people that didn't do anything. So after the Portuguese and during the Portuguese Reconquista, I would like you to talk to my audience about in the Iberian Peninsula, but in Spain too. So how did it went, and how it worked as a factor of forming creating the nations of Portugal and Spain?
How the Reconquista
Yeah, it
was.
helped. How it helped?
Well, I mean, the identity of Spain, and actually, let's go back to your first point, because it's important, about how, the Reconquista is presented as just these bad people attacking innocent, advanced, tolerant Moors and kicking them out. Okay,
Sure.
well, that I know that's very popular today, and that's what people want to believe, but that is part of the big lie, which I was alluding to earlier when I talked about the importance of history and how it's being manipulated. Okay, so if you look at the sources, if you look at the history, if you look at just human nature and common sense, you understand what happened, which is you had a very violent and intolerant people who were fueled by a violent and intolerant religion, namely Islam, who crossed, into Europe, into Spain's, into Hispania, Iberian Peninsula, and engaged in in jihad. Essentially, that's how they describe it themselves in their own books, and that's how even the Christians talk about it. That they talk about, a lot of people now, when they talk about Islam in Spain, it's almost as if, they came there and, yeah, the Visigoths just gave into them and it was wonderful and there was really no violence and it was a wonderful
Sure.
time. Well, that's not what the sources say. I mean, they present it like some sort of apocalypse, okay, like horrific massacres and atrocities, Christians who would not give in, and they would trap them in a church and burn the church with all of them alive. Mass enslavement of women and children for sexual enslavement. In fact, Cordoba, when it was under the Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, was a slave emporium, one of the largest slave emporiums of the Islamic world, which is saying something, precisely because it was in Europe, and it was from there that they would hunt European slaves and sell them all throughout the Islamic world. So it was definitely not this multicultural paradise. That is one of the big lies. The only truth possibly that we can say, and I have an analogy for this, the only truth is that Andalusia was actually rich and advanced and prosperous. Okay, so that is a truth. But why was it? Well, it was because it was raiding Europe. It was enslaving. Okay, and so to give you an idea, an analogy, it's like, imagine going to, I've said this before, but imagine, the UAE and Dubai and all these Gulf nations, and, they have these massive skyscrapers, which are very impressive. Let's say 100 years pass and the world has changed and many countries have been destroyed and we don't even know what that place is like. And you see these massive buildings and then you say, wow, what an amazing civilization and what achievements they must have had. But if you really know what's going on, well, this is actually a very Islamic Sharia law, mentality, but they happen to have oil wealth and they buy stuff that Western people come build for them. Okay, so that there's nothing intrinsic to it. So I would argue it was the same thing. When you look at Al-Andalus, whatever was going on, primarily wealth and architecture, that's it, okay? Well, that doesn't really tell me that they were an advanced society, because during the same time, all the things that we were talking about, the Sharia, was full-blown. So as one example, during the so-called golden age of Islam in Cordoba, this is when you get the martyrs of Cordoba, I think around 850. And this is basically Christians who had acquiesced and submitted to Islam and paid the tax, the jizya, and were dhimmis, but because they were always being oppressed and had enough and tired of Christianity being mocked, they just went off and just started proclaiming Christ, saying Muhammad's a false prophet, and they were all tortured to death, boiled alive, beheaded, crucified, and skinned during the Golden Age. Okay. So my point is, culturally and mentally, these were 7th century. The mentality of 7th century Sharia Bedouins, okay, but yeah, they had nice buildings. So that's sure. that's the idea, yeah. Okay, but they weren't exactly tolerant or advanced people the way they want you to think. So that was a little digression, because we're talking about how the Reconquista presented as a bad thing, and this again, like I said, is for political manipulation to make and it's working, because last I saw, Spain took in, I don't know. It justified taking in 500,000 or 1 million migrants, okay? Yeah. Because and this is how history is weaponized. If you knew the real history as we are discussing it, well, you wouldn't do that, obviously. If the Spain spent 8 centuries to get Islam out, Portugal got it out earlier, I think 1249, then maybe there's a lesson to learn. But that entire history has been suppressed and presented as the opposite. Oh, look at those intolerant northern Spaniards. They didn't embrace multiculturalism. Now we have to make up for it, etc., etc. And so I know you had another question, but this was the first for context. I think you were asking, how again it worked. And the bottom line is just the mentality. The Spains and Portugal and Spain later, the Spains become Spain. With Ferdinand and Isabella, they unify Castile and Aragon, I believe. And so without these countries, Spain and Portugal today, are completely inconceivable without the Reconquista, which is essentially the Iberian version of the Crusades. Yeah. Okay, that's how they were forged over centuries, almost a millennium. Imagine that. And unfortunately, that history has been jettisoned, and like I said, we've been given the antithesis of it, a lie, and that's why these countries in Europe in general are just on such a decline, because they've been completely indoctrinated and brainwashed in a false history. They don't know their own heritage. It's been demonized. This happens all the time in the United States here and in Europe, where the heroes of the West and the hero are all demonized, all presented in a much worse way than they were. While at the same time elevating Muslims and making them look good when they were bad. Okay. So anyway, at any rate, yes, the Reconquista Crusader mentality militant, military order mentality. All of these were very fundamental to the Reconquista, to the forging of modern Spain and Portugal. And even, okay, so here's a really forgotten chapter from history, and it deals again with the Templars and Portugal. So as I mentioned earlier, Alfonso Enrique was a great sponsor of the Templars, but Portugal played another important role when the Templars were being dissolved around 1312, I believe, due to all the false charges that were coming from the French king, who even at the time people knew were fake, that he just wanted to appropriate their money as he had done to other peoples before them. So a lot of the other kings actually were supportive or indifferent, and they didn't want to hunt down the Templars. But the Portugal actually took them because they had the Templars were always there, like I mentioned. And I think one of their oldest fortresses, Tomas, I believe, or Toma. And what they actually did, the Portuguese king, I think Dennis, is he created a new order called the Order of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And this order was essentially the Templars. He took in Templars, and it was basically the Templars in all but name. So they changed their name, and they became the Order of the Christ, and this was their final refuge in Portugal. And from there, the age of exploration starts, essentially with Prince Henry, the navigator, Portuguese, and he is essentially he's I believe the master of the Order of the Knights, which is essentially almost to say the master of the Templars. And if you look at what he was doing and his goals, it was Crusader mentality, military order, Templar mentality. Jerusalem was still a focal point, which they wanted to liberate eventually. But now, instead of going overland, they had so the Reconquista is done. Spain is liberated. Muslims are now just in North Africa, and the war continues because North Africa was Christian too. And why not bring it back under Christian rule? And why not conquer all of North Africa and march all the way to the Holy Land? And so these were actual ideas that percolated during this time. But Prince Henry decided to do it by ship, by sailing. Mm-hmm. And so all those early sailings that we hear about and all these expeditions were in the context of the Crusade. So once again, Islam had propelled and was the genesis of what's going on, which again, when I don't know, I'm sure not in Portugal, but here in the United States, we're not taught that. We're just taught, oh, it's an age of exploration, and we're not at all told that it was
colonizers.
Yeah, exactly. And one of his missions, Prince Henry, was to try to find Prester John. So this is an old legend, as it's called now. I don't know if it was a legend, maybe it was real, but it was believed to be a very powerful Christian king somewhere in the east, and then sometimes he was in the south. And the idea was to make an alliance with him, and because if he's far east, then he's so you have the Christians, and then you have Islam, and then he's here. So they wanted to make an alliance with him so they can do a pincer movement on Islam.
Okay.
And sometimes they thought he was a Mongol in the Far East. Sometimes it was believed he was an Ethiopian king. But anyway, so the point is, a lot of what we know as the age of exploration and colonialism was in the context of fighting against Islam and in crusading and in trying to recover Christian holy territories. You know, people like Vasco da Gama.
Yeah.
He was of the military order of the Order of Christ, which is to say he was a Templar. Mm-hmm. And you know, he's very famous for all his. Even when you look, it still shows up in movies when you watch their large boats in this age of exploration. It's a red cross on white. That's the Templar insignia. So Portugal is really important in the sense that not only did it sponsor the military orders and Templars, but it actually kept them alive under a different name. I think that's remarkable, and very few people know that.
One of the final questions I would like to ask you, it's you've become famous, at least to me, speaking about these tensions that are most likely ignored by politicians and even professors at universities and some other people. And today we're looking at some histories is back, like to quote a really important author. And I would like to ask you, how are we able to defend ourselves if we don't even understand how the history works, or at least we don't know the details of the history, so we can't even define the enemies, the people that came here for some horrible reasons, some of them, and how can we reverse this situation, considering that people don't even know the history, the politicians don't know, or if they know, they pretend they don't. So the problem today is it's like multiculturalism came in. Whoever it is, it doesn't matter if you have a historical religious purpose of, I don't know, destroying a nation or even destroying a civilization. So I would like to ask you, how can we handle in the West this type of threat, knowing that the politicians at least pretend they don't know history?
Yeah, well, this is actually a very important topic, fundamentally important, and one that's been on my mind, which is, and I touched on it earlier. The problem isn't even that they don't know history. That is a huge problem. But it's oftentimes they teach the opposite,
Mhm.
which is even more dangerous. Okay. So in the context of what we're discussing, Islam and Europe and Christianity and Portugal, it's not even that they don't know it. They'll tell you the opposite. They'll tell you, no, it was the Muslims came peacefully and they brought civilization and literature and knowledge and wealth, and these evil bigoted Christians drove them out. Okay, so it's even much worse. And the reason
Yeah.
they do that, it's intentional, is because if that is what I grow up believing, then yes, I should be tolerant. I should give them the benefit of the doubt. I should take them in. I should make up for the sins of my ancestors. That's the logic. Okay. And I talk just about Islam and Europe. And from what I've seen, from how I've studied it, there's what professors and scholars write. There's what popular history teaches. There's what's in the movies. And most of that is in one camp. And then there's what the sources actually say. And they are, again, increasingly so different. Okay. When I talk about professors, some are good, but a lot of them are just academic and nobody even reads them, and they're very bland. Some are, again, politically charged in the way that I just described, which is they give you the opposite explanation. If you go to like here in the United States, if you go to a bookstore like Barnes and Nobles, and you go into the history section, let's say of the Middle East, all the books you will encounter are the books that teach that, which is that, Islam was wonderful, Europe was backwards, et cetera, et cetera. Your audience may like to know, for example, there's a professor, his name is John Esposito. He was at Georgetown. He was very popular back in the day. He's written many books. He was the editor of the Oxford History of Islam. And in one of his books, he basically says, literally verbatim, that 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians elapsed before an imperial papal power play led to a series of so-called holy wars and centuries of mistrust and resentment from Muslims. In other words, before the First Crusade, Muslims and Christians were living in peace and tolerance.
Okay.
Well, the reality is actually Muslims conquered nearly 3/4 of the Christian world in the centuries before the First Crusade and destroyed tens of thousands of churches and killed and slaughtered Christians. Okay, so he doesn't tell you that, but then he tells you because the Christians responded finally, they're the bad guys. So this is what we're taught. And again, the movies, if you watch the movies, I don't know how they are in Portugal, but in America, the big budget movies, the Muslims look always tolerant. They're advanced, they're enlightened.
Mhm.
Yeah. And the Christians are all crazy, backward savages. Okay.
Sure.
So history is being weaponized very intentionally. And I would also say, I only look and talk about the Islam question, but I believe it's happening in even more important and fundamental aspects of history. Okay. So, we have this narrative, dark ages, bad, suffocating Christian forces, then wonderful enlightenment. And then we learn religion is something you just don't do. And the more we do that, our society becomes wonderful and we're secular and now we're humanists and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not working, is it? Because if you look at it, it's not working because it was never true. You see, I believe actually the medieval era was probably the greatest era of Europe's civilization. But no one will tell you that. They'll tell you that was the darkest, most evil time. Okay, but that's again because there's an agenda behind history and how one manipulates it. Okay, and this isn't to say there's a mass conspiracy where everyone who goes and gets a PhD and writes a dissertation is intentionally lying. It doesn't work that way. What happens is once the zeitgeist, once the spirit, once the logic is in the air, then everyone conforms to it and they write and think that way because that's what you got to do. Okay, but like I said, if you objectively look at things and you study the sources and take the time to do that, you will get a very different picture. And I think that will happen when you look at different topics as well that deal with European history, vis-a-vis anything. So this is a serious and a very important project. I would love it if one day there was some sort of institute dedicated to this that would actually get, top ranked scholars of different historical fields and aspects to really go back and, reassess everything, and including by looking at the primary sources. I believe we're going to get a very different story than the one that we're constantly fed.
Yeah, and we're going to be probably more proud of it too. So we're not going to be apologizing anytime that's possible. There's a great book that talks about it. That's like how the church saved the West. I believe it's a really great book. But I wanted to ask you, just for the final question, where can people find your work? What books have you recently written? And how can we see you again in the YouTube and the other social media, and even in the books?
Well, sure. Thanks. And thanks for asking. I have met several books, but if you're interested in the topics that I discussed, there's really 3 so far. And they are the first, if you read them in order, you should read the first one, should be the oldest, which came out in 2018. It's called Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. And this is a broad overview of the historic conflict between Islam and Christendom, beginning with that first battle I told you I wrote a thesis about. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636, and I go all the way up till the present. And I have an entire chapter about Spain, and the chapters are like Spain and Portugal. They're about 40, about the Reconquista, in other words. They're about 40 pages. So you'll see it century by century, these wars that went on, and how the Christians thought and spoke, which is very different than you may expect, and how the Muslims thought and spoke, hint, kind of like ISIS, okay, like very, very radical. And then the other 2 books, which can be read in either order, one is Defenders of the West, and this one looks at various Christian heroes. And I have a couple of, Spaniards, but the stories of all of them are in those chapters, but I think it's El Cid and Fernando III. And I have others, people from the Balkans, including Vlad the Impaler and Richard the Lionheart and so forth. And a lot of people find that book very inspiring because it gives you a different. It's basically like the first book, but it's through the lives of these various men. So each chapter is a biography of one of these warriors, and people find that book very inspiring. And then my most recent, which came out last November, is The Two Swords of Christ. And that's the one that deals with the military orders, particularly the Knights of the Temple and the Knights of the Hospital. And that's also a very interesting one, especially for anyone who's interested in the Crusades, because as I mentioned, the military orders were the backbone of the Crusades. So in writing a book about them, I had to basically cover the Crusades very closely. So this book is even the longest one. It's over 500 pages. And I have a YouTube channel, which I think is just my name. The logo is the Holy War channel. And a lot of these topics, I discuss them there as well. And I have a website which has all this information and links to my books, RaymondIbrahim.com, and also a link there to my Substack, where I'm actively writing articles.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Thank you so much, Mr. Ibrahim, for your time. It was really a pleasure. I will leave any links that Mr. Ibrahim leaves me to in my description. You can find his books, his channel, his Substack, whatever he mentioned that he thinks it's worthy of your time. He will give me the links for sure. And thank you so much for being here. I don't know if I told you, but this is my first interview conducted in English, so I hope it went a little bit well, at least. So I hope it's doing well. So yeah, you will find any information of Mr. Ibrahim in the description. And thank you all for your time today.